Hey guys, Tyler Berger here with Bass Fishing HQ, and today I want to talk about 4 patterns that you can utilize in the spring to become a master at the chatterbait. Stay tuned, it's going to be a good one. Before we get into the video, this video is brought to you by the Bass Hat. So don't forget to click on the link in the description below if you want to purchase one of these to help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel. So one of the best things about a chatterbait is it seems that if you can get on a good chatterbait bite, you're gonna catch big fish. You see a lot of tournaments won during the spring on the chatterbait. And I'm gonna say chatterbait a lot because that's just what I call it. I know it's called a bladed jig. And there's a lot of different bladed jigs on the market, but the chatterbait was the original. And I'm actually getting ready to do a comparison test with a bunch of different bladed jigs. So make sure you guys subscribe if you want to see that in the future. One of the best things about a chatterbait is it catches big fish. And the other thing is that it seems to work throughout the entire year. You can catch fish in the summer on it, in the fall, in the winter. But it really seems to shine during that spring period. In the pre-spawn and in the post-spawn, it can really catch a lot of big fish. Today I want to talk about 4 different patterns that you can actually use a chatterbait for in the spring. 2 of these patterns are going to be in the pre-spawn, and 2 of these patterns are going to be during the post-spawn. So whether it's early in the spring or late in the spring, you're going to be able to use the chatterbait to catch a lot of fish and a lot of big fish. The first pattern that I want to talk about when it comes to fishing a chatterbait is actually fishing it in the pre-spawn, typically when that water is somewhere in that 50 to 60 degree range. And during this time, you're actually going to target scattered clumps of grass to catch these chatterbait bass. Now, one thing you want to know about grass is during the spring of the year, grass is kind of just starting to grow, right? It kind of tends to die down during the winter. And during the spring, it really starts to kind of pop up and it starts to grow. Now, when it grows, bass love to utilize this as they kind of stage before the spawn. And so what I really like to do with this pattern is I like to target like bays and small creek arms that have just scattered clumps of grass in it. And a lot of times you'll find that in these bays, you'll have some spawning grounds, and just outside these spawning grounds, you're gonna have little staging points, right? It might be a little secondary point, it might be a little creek channel swing, just these little staging areas. And if you have grass on those areas, it is a dynamite place to catch these pre-spawn early spring bass. Typically when I'm fishing grassier lakes, they tend to be a little bit cleaner. So in that case, I really like a white chatterbait, typically like a 3/8 to a 1/2 ounce size. And I'm gonna match it with some sort of swim bait style trailers. So that could be a Kitech style, like boot tail style swim bait, or it could be a swim bait here that doesn't have a whole lot of action by itself, but when you pair it with the chatterbait, it's gonna have a whole lot of action. So pattern number 1 is finding scattered clumps of grass that are staging areas that bass utilize before they go up and actually spawn. So pattern 2 that I wanna talk about, and this is what seems to work in kind of clearer, like rockier lakes. So we just talked about kind of a grass lake. Now maybe you fish a lake that maybe is a little bit more clear. Maybe it has more rock and wood laydowns and things like that. What you find a lot of times in the pre-spawn and during the spring is, obviously in the spring we get a lot of heavy rains. So what you find a lot of times in these clearer lakes that up the river and in certain creek arms, you actually have kind of like muddy water start to come in as you get a lot of spring rain. And using a chatterbait in those muddy water areas in the backs end of these creeks is a phenomenal pattern to catch some really, really big bass. So when I'm fishing this pattern, again, I'm targeting like up the river portions of lakes and in bigger creek arms that are a little bit muddy. And what I really like to do is literally just fish a chatterbait around any type of visible cover that I can see. So visible cover might be a riprap bank or a bridge piling. What I end up fishing a lot of times in the spring in this pattern is just wood, around wood laydowns and stumps and any kind of wood that I can find. So again, when that water starts to muddy, a lot of those clear water fish are actually going to get pushed into it. And when they get pushed into it, they tend to be pretty shallow. So So again, I'm targeting visible cover that I can see. I'm using a chatterbait to basically hunt around and pick off those bass. And the best thing is you can really catch a lot of big bass doing this. Now, personally, when I'm doing this, I'm fishing a lot of shallow water. Most of the time you're fishing 1 to about 3 foot of water. So a 3/8 ounce chatterbait is about all that you need. I really like that red color or a white and chartreuse color in the mud. Red can be really, really good in the spring, as we know, so I always kind of start with that. And another thing that you guys are going to want to make sure you do is a little trick, a little modification to your chatterbait. So if you're fishing this way and you're fishing around a lot of wood, what tends to happen is that people use a swim bait style chatterbait. When that chatterbait comes up to a log, it'll actually roll over on the log and it'll get hung in the log, and it creates a lot of frustration. So what you want to do is you want to take a trailer that's more of a crawl style bait, something that's flatter, something that is more like a beaver, okay? A lot of cases I like to use a Strike King Rage Bug. What you want to do in this case is make sure that that bait is laying flat. It's laying horizontal, it's laying perpendicular to your hook. And this actually kind of keeps that bait riding straight when it comes across logs, when it comes across limbs and things like that. It really helps that bait to come through wood cover a lot more effectively. So pattern number 2, find muddy water in clear water lakes. Those are the 2 patterns that I really like for pre-spawn bass. So let's talk about bass that are post-spawn bass, right? This is still kind of in the spring, but it tends to be kind of more in that May and even June time frame when the bass are kind of in that post-spawn stage. Now what tends to happen during the post-spawn is that bass are going to start leaving the shallows where they had spawned, and they're going to start making their way out to deeper water for the most part. But what happens along the way is 2 things that a chatterbait can be a deadly lure to use during this time. So the first thing that happens is a shad spawn. Shad tend to spawn when that water is around 70 degrees in the spring. And when the shad are spawning, it is a fantastic time to catch bass on a chatterbait, because a chatterbait is going to mimic a shad very, very well. Now there's a lot of different areas that shad are actually going to spawn, right? One of the best areas where you can use a chatterbait is on docks. Shad love to spawn on the underside of dock floats. Sometimes you'll be fishing like big docks or even single docks, and you'll see shad kind of just coming across the surface, and you'll actually see them down there. And what they're doing is they're laying their eggs. Their eggs are really sticky, and they'll actually lay their eggs on the bottom side of those floats. A chatterbait is a great way to target the bass that are actually sitting below those spawning shad and eating those shad. And what I like to do in this case, I'm gonna skip this chatterbait as far back under docks as I possibly can. And here's the crazy thing about fishing this pattern, this shad spawn pattern, is that you might be fishing a dock that's in 20 or 30 or 40 feet of water, but those bass are gonna be suspended about 5-6 feet below those floats, just waiting to pick off some shad when they can. So you want to keep your chatterbait really high in the water column. You want to keep that chatterbait just below the floats. Bring that right below the floats, and you're going to get hammered by some big bass. And again, the best thing about a chatterbait is that it really skips really, really well, right? So you can skip this chatterbait way up under a dock, keep it high in the water column, and you're going to catch some really big bass during the post spawn on a white chatterbait. All right, guys, so let's talk about another pattern. This is the 4th pattern that works in the spring for chatterbaits. And this is a really, really fun one, and it tends to catch really big bass, okay? And this pattern is actually targeting bluegill beds. Like I said earlier, after the bass spawn, you're going to have a shad spawn. And you're also going to have a bluegill spawn. So typically when that water is over 70, 75 degrees, and you're getting closer to summer now, you're still kind of in late springtime, you're gonna have bluegills that actually start to make beds. Now the biggest time that you actually see them making these beds is under full moon circumstances. So pay really close attention to a full moon during this time, because a lot of times if you have a full moon and you're in that post-spawn time frame, you're gonna have bluegills that start to make beds. And what typically happens is you have bass that are now going to start feeding on those bluegills that are on these bluegill beds, right? Because the bluegill have basically kind of trapped themselves in shallow water. It's a perfect place for bass to basically ambush them as they're trying to make these beds. So basically, to find these bluegill beds, you just have to kind of keep your trolling motor on high and look for the beds themselves. A lot of times you're gonna find them in some of the same areas where you have bass beds, but a lot of times you'll find them on like main lake points, like just on the inside of the point, or in little small pockets in a creek. Those are typical areas where you'll find these bluegill beds. Now the bass are actually typically going to hang around kind of the sides of the bluegill bed. They're not gonna be like right smack dab in the bluegill bed. They're gonna be kind of hanging in the shadows, waiting for that bluegill to kind of turn just right where it can go up and nail it. What I like to do in this case is I like to use a green pumpkin chatterbait, and typically I'm gonna put a trailer on it. I might put a little bit of orange or chartreuse on the tip of the trailer to really make it look like a bluegill, and I'm gonna fish this chatterbait on the outside of the bluegill bed. This is a perfect way to imitate a bluegill, and it's a perfect way to catch some really, really big bass. So the best thing about this is that, guys, bluegill will spawn multiple times a year, and they will spawn actually going into the summer. So anytime you have full moons, you wanna start looking for bluegill beds, and a chatterbait, again, fished on the outside edges, especially in the right conditions. If you kind of have some cloudy, overcast, or windy conditions, that's when a chatterbait is really gonna shine around bluegill beds. I hope that you can utilize these 4 patterns this year and for multiple years to come. Tie on a chatterbait, use these patterns, and you're gonna catch a lot more chatterbait bass in the spring. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up. Please comment below if you have any questions, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next video.